So I think the topic of this is going to be something to do with general philosophy of the European Union, whether you like it, what you like about it, what you don't like about it, why you voted as you did in 2016. Because you guys are relatively young. I mean, you're in your 20s, are you? Or?
27.
Yeah. And you're
32.
32. So it's interesting to get you guys' opinion, because you're meant to be Remainers, right?
Yes.
So
according to some.
So Ben, why did you vote to leave in 2016?
I think, in terms of the reasons I personally voted, it wasn't about so much what I see in the campaign, and I've had a desire, should I say, to leave the European Union before there was even talk of a referendum.
Right.
And it was purely because I was working in Europe, travelling, and I've just become interested in, for example, how it is I can cross the border between France and Belgium in my car and not have to stop and speak to somebody or tell them where I'm going and show them my passport. And seeing the old border checks being dismantled and things like that as I travel across Europe. So I developed a keen interest in how all of that worked. And I was still quite young, obviously, at the time, so my interest in politics was only still very new. I thought it was great. I thought the idea that people could travel across borders freely, especially in the Benelux area, which is Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and then obviously into Germany and France. I thought the idea you could freely move, there was no checks, delays, should I say, at borders. Everything seemed to be in line with each other, and it all seemed very good on the face of it. And then I started digging into how historically the European Union come about, how it evolved, should I say, into what it is today. And I noticed, I think, from not just our perspective, but in many cases across Europe, there was a lack of democratic process in place that whereby such control had been consolidated, should I say, to Brussels or to the ECJ in Luxembourg or whatever it would be. I didn't feel that the European Union had pursued the correct avenues in ensuring that member states actually showed the citizens of member states actually showed a keen interest in becoming part of this ever closer union that has been built over time.
So your problem was really with the democratic deficit and political union, basically?
Yeah, so I think as time developed, and I think we could use the United Kingdom as an example, we were signed up to the single market, I think, 73, was it 73?
Yeah.
Insofar as it existed, the single market properly existed post-92, but the foundations of it, yes.
So when we were signed up originally, we then had a vote afterwards, I understand, in 75. Which was fine. That's a democratic process, great. But I think since then we've had multiple treaties, Maastricht, more recently the Lisbon Treaty. And I recall that in 2005 the Labour Party run on a manifesto promise that they would hold a referendum on the matter.
On
the Lisbon
European
Treaty.
Constitution,
I think it was the European Constitution.
As it was then called.
I think it was a European Constitution which France, I think Ireland and the Netherlands also rejected.
Voted against,
and that was, from my perspective, from my view, that just seemed to be edited slightly and then rushed through.
As a renamed Lisbon Treaty.
Renamed the Lisbon Treaty, it all sounds very fancy. And come 2008, we were signed in. There was no democratic mandate, in my opinion, for elements of our sovereignty to be transferred over to Brussels. And from I suppose from having a more business background, it would somewhat feel that MPs have outsourced their jobs to Brussels, and they haven't really sought the democratic mandate from the general public to do so.
What do you think, Patrick?
On that point, I would largely agree. I think, yes, that has been, I think it was one of the turning points and one of the more major turning points in public opinion beginning to shift towards a realization that actually these changes, such as Lisbon, will be steamrolled through whether people want them or not. And I expect that for a lot of people that will have been the beginning or close to the beginning of the evolution of their belief that actually this isn't really something that's very us. in a lot of ways, if you see what I mean, British.
What do you mean by that?
That's not the way that
I mean,
we would want this country to work.
But our betters, if you will, in the parliament over there wanted it to work that way. They must have our interests at heart. We live in a representative democracy.
Well, I'm certainly not totally against the idea of representative democracy. It's how a lot of things have to work. But I think when you are almost misleading the people in the sense that you are promising, as many governments do promise many things that they then don't do, but if you are promising the people that these huge changes won't be made unless they give consent to it, and then you fail to implement that
Right.
in a manner that actually in some ways mirrors what goes on in Brussels, what goes on in the rest of Europe, what went on in France, Ireland, the Netherlands. I can imagine that people's beliefs may well have started to shift if they weren't already in that direction at roughly that point. I took note of that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have predicted back then that this was what was going to happen, that we were going to have a referendum organised on membership of the EU at all.
Yeah.
But certainly ideas were fermenting in my mind at the time.
Triggered the rise of UKIP, didn't it, in some ways? As time went on, UKIP becomes such a...
All those forces were around at the time, but yes, I can see it being a triggering point to a degree, yes.
I mean, it was kind of that perfect storm of YouTube, Nigel Farage, the European
Social media.
elections in 2014 or whenever it was, where they won it. But what happened, right? So there was the European Constitution that was being formed in the early 2000s, wasn't there? Labour, I think you mentioned, had a platform where they promised that they would have was it a referendum on the European
would be a referendum.
Constitution? But they kind of didn't have to fulfil that because it was binned by the European Union before they had an opportunity to do that. Is that what happened?
From my understanding of it, it was, I wouldn't say it was binned, but I would say perhaps elements of it changed, and I think some texts were added to the Lisbon Treaty, and it was kind of rebranded in some way.
Essentially, yes, rebranded. I would argue it was a fairly superficial rewrite, that we were going to stop using this idea of a flag or an anthem, or we were stop calling it a constitution, basically. But there wasn't a great deal of fundamental difference.
So that was the kind of weasel way, the technicality that Labour kind of got out of having a referendum.
And the EU as well.
And
I think yes, as you say, the weasel words. I think that is how it was perceived, that this was a fudge to get it through. They were going to do it regardless.
Yeah.
They needed to make the changes that they needed to make, however superficial they were, to get people to believe it was okay. And that's what they did. They didn't take fundamental notice of the fact that people wanted changes, which means fundamental changes. It doesn't mean a few tweaks here and there.
Yeah.
Although, of course, interestingly, we could draw that back to the withdrawal agreement, couldn't we? That what the ERG wants now and what the other factions in Parliament want now is fundamental changes to that. And instead, all we're seeing, even our own elected representatives doing over in Brussels, is trying to negotiate these fairly minor tweaks. Because that's all the EU will allow. Once it's agreed something, and it has a history of this, once it's agreed something at that level, it will not allow that to be fundamentally reopened, fundamentally altered, only tweaked with the notion of getting it past a democracy in a member state. So I see nothing new here going on versus what went on with
So
that
it's got
referendum
the
that was
same
not to be.
personality it's always had since '92 when the
I
European
think that's
Union was
arguable,
created.
yes. Yeah.
I mean, one thing that struck me is that the point that you mentioned about the ability to change after you've made a decision, to go back and revisit it and possibly either undo or change it. That seems the European Union seems to be designed to be a ratchet. You know what I mean? Something's enacted, and then it's put into law, and then there's no strong or effective way for people to affect democratic change to that. I mean, what do you have an opinion on that? Or?
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the EU's been described as the steamroller by some.
Right.
That changes will be steamrolled through, whether people are really very comfortable with them or not. And I think that is what we're seeing here. When we look at that from a philosophical point of view, there is this whole setup, this whole way of working that seems to be in the favour of these elites who will make these decisions without any real trust in the populace to decide whether they are acceptable or not.
Yeah.
Now, this sort of brings me back a bit to philosophical texts that you can read. There's The Republic by Plato, and Plato is describing this concept in there of the philosopher kings, which is a concept envisioned by Socrates.
Yeah.
Socrates, for those who don't know, he's a bit like Jesus in the Bible. He didn't write anything himself, but he figures in the narrative of other texts by Plato, Xenophon, a couple of others. And Socrates was not a fan of democracy at all. To be fair, he was a calm, reasonable, rational man in a mad world of ancient Greece. And the way he wanted things to be was that the world, or Greece or Athens, would be led by these philosopher kings, these people who are trained to be rulers.
The leaders, yeah.
Leaders.
Yeah.
And that the right way to do it was to have those people, to bring them up that way, and that they should take the decisions. He feared this idea, really, of democracy. Now, what's interesting about the way that Plato was writing that was that at the time, Plato was a very bitter man at that time because of what ultimately happened to Socrates. They killed him. They poisoned him. Or they forced him to take poison himself because his ideas were too radical, or what we might call too sensible.
So wait a second. Socrates was advocating a technocracy,
Essentially.
and how did Plato fit into this?
Plato was a follower, you might call him a disciple of Socrates.
Yeah.
He very much agreed with these findings, and when they killed him, he became, in his later years, this very bitter man who saw no benefit in the demos making decisions whatsoever because of what they'd done to his master, his leader. And so when he was writing this, there is this cynicism, a very deep cynicism that you can read into it, about human beings and the way they behave, the way they ought to be ruled.
Yeah.
And I see that cynicism really at the heart of the European Union. If we look at it in the aftermath of World War II, I mean, at that time, twice in 50 years, Europe had gone to war, devastating wars, the like of which we hadn't seen before. And I can understand that at that point, people were thinking, look, we can't trust the people. We've got to draw things together in such a way that we remove that choice and indeed that accountability, and we have these people. I don't think they were necessarily referring to Plato's Republic, but I see the same idea. 2,000 years later, I see the same thing
so they're
going
modelling it on similar philosophical lines.
I don't think they are directly modelling it on that, but I see one thing there 2,000 years ago, I see another one 70 years ago, and actually this cynicism that it's founded upon, which they think is positivity, they think is progress, but actually to try and build a model of progress that is based upon a fundamental precept that you cannot trust the peoples of different countries to make democratic decisions. I don't call that progress.
What do you think, Ben? I mean, do you think that people should be trusted with big decisions, like, for example, leaving a political union, pan-European political union?
I think it could vary, very much so, on culture, traditionally, I suppose you could use the United Kingdom as an example. As a united kingdom, it has in many ways been quite a strong democratic force that's progressed freedom and democracy.
It's like a mini European Union, isn't it?
Almost as such, but I'm not too knowledgeable on the philosophy side of things. But
right.
I think what Patrick was describing actually, just listening just now, it does actually quite very much reflect the model that the European Union might well be quite closely aligned with.
Yeah.
I think he's right, and in terms of when he says that it's not directly modelled on that philosophy, or even that the European Union may have even looked at and followed that philosophy at all. It could well be that 2,000 years later, somebody or the group of people, whoever they might be, have come up with this.
They ended up with the same thinking.
Yeah, pretty much. They've developed this idea that, well, since we've had two big wars, obviously Europe can't be trusted. And I don't think I don't think it could necessarily be wrong in some cases, because if you look at countries like Germany in the early 20th century, yeah, it was allied with the wrong people, should we say, and that went on to progress to Hitler.
Careful.
But yeah, I mean, if you look at certain aspects of the early 20th century, we had the Armenian massacre, and there were issues in Germany at that time. And I don't dismiss that the European Union has done good to create unity in Europe, but I don't think that the United Kingdom and the people of the United Kingdom really needed to be included in such a system, because they couldn't be trusted to run themselves. I think the United Kingdom has had more of a...
Well, we've had a stable democracy for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's the point I'm trying to...
You're saying that because of our history, we possibly have demonstrated that we can govern ourselves,
I think a lot of people
without
see
being
that
in a
as
political
well.
union.
Yes.
I think a lot of people see that as well from...
May I just pick up on the point on unity? I think it's quite right to point out that there are some ways in which Europe is now more united than it was. There are also ways of saying I'm not sure if it is. And I think there's a question there of, there's a definition of what is unity. Well, unity is people coming together to work in the common good through their own choice.
Yes.
If they are not doing so through choice, then I would say that is not union, that is dominion.
Yes.
And actually, you know, this is why I have a problem with ever closer union as a fundamental principle. Because what it actually creates is this homogeneity, where we're removing differences, we're removing choice, we're flattening things out, we're spreading things out. And actually, when people are technically working together there, it isn't unity, because there is far less choice going on.
So Patrick, what are the arguments against Plato and Socrates? So, I mean, it seems to be two very highly educated people with big brains have come up with technocracy and said that, you know, that's the way forward. What's the argument against that?
It's also interesting, the exchange just earlier about should we have a referendum on that sort of thing, or should we not?
Yeah.
If I can just answer by means of that. I can deal with representative democracy, where we do elect these people and they do make those decisions and we trust them to do so. And I don't have a fundamental problem with that. In terms of should we have had a referendum, I think the thing was, if it is clear, by whatever manner, that there is enough appetite in the country for there to actually be now some direct democracy, then I see that as no smoke without a fire. There is a reason for that. And then we should have a referendum, then we should engage with that. Do you see what I'm trying to say? In terms of, you know, what are the arguments against it? Maybe it's a case of saying there's a time and a place for everything. There's a time and a place for representative democracy.
Yeah.
There's also a time and a place for direct democracy by means of a referendum or a plebiscite. And if it's clear that the mood is there in the country, the appetite is there in the country for actually, on this particular issue, a bit of direct democracy, well, our democracy is strong and old and robust enough to navigate those winds, to pick up on when that's the case, to then hold the referendum, and I want to say, to then enact the result. But I don't find myself sitting here opposite this building in particular and saying, I can actually finish that sentence and say we are going to enact the result.
Would you say that democracy is kind of a continuum, right? It's quite a nuanced thing, you know. Perhaps the European Union for us as leavers is not offering enough direct democracy for our...
It doesn't allow room for it.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain elements of direct democracy in the sense that you're directly electing a party representative, aren't you? So you're in England, not forgetting Northern Ireland, where they've got a different mechanism. We use the proportional representation system for electing MEPs. So in some sense, it's direct democracy in the European Union. But I think, for me, the Parliament doesn't have enough democratic strength.
May I pick up on that?
Go on.
If we just compare and contrast that to the system we have in the UK.
Yeah.
So we have the House of Commons and we have the House of Lords. And the House of Commons is elected, and the House of Lords is appointed.
Yeah.
And the House of Commons can propose, well, the government, the executive, and also private members' bills can propose legislation, debate it. They send it to the Lords. The Lords can amend it. They'd come back to the Commons and it can be enacted, hopefully. Now, if you look at the way that Europe works, it's kind of that system turned on its head, really. Because the only people who are elected, the Parliament, are not allowed to propose any new legislation. The only
Formally,
people,
no.
formally, indeed, they can only amend. So it's a bit like saying in this country, if we had a House of Commons and a House
Well,
of
they
Lords,
can't even formally amend. They can just make recommendations.
they can make suggestions, yes.
Yeah,
And but a lot of them are enacted. It's fair to say that.
Right.
They are accepted. But it's as though in this country, in this building over here, we had our Commons and we had our Lords, and only the Lords were allowed to propose laws. And I think if you are somebody who is actually interested in democracy, then no one who would ever even conceive of such a backward system, never mind implement it and then tell a few fibs about what it actually means for democracy.
Well, people are unhappy enough about the House of Lords as it stands, right? If they were to invert it, and yet that's what, all the delegated competencies that the European Union has, that's the way it works. And yet people seem to be happy about that. There seems to be an inconsistency there.
It is exactly what you would do if you wanted to look democratic, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
The Commission's up there and the EU Council is up there proposing the laws, coming up with the laws they're going to make and then proposing them. People are down here. I see the European Parliament, which is directly elected, as a sort of insulating layer between the rulers and the people. The people, when they look up, all they see is this insulating layer. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
It's exactly what you'd do if you wanted to look democratic.
What do you think, Ben?
I agree with Patrick entirely on that subject. It does come across to a lot of people, and a lot of people that I've spoken to, it's like, well, we have a commission whereby we have a president, they're proposing laws, you've got the... I think also another aspect of it is actually a lot of people are interested in having their voices heard, but they don't always really care about how the system in depth really works.
Yeah.
So what we've got at the moment, if you look at, if you really take a step back and you place yourself in the position of somebody who goes to work 9 to 5 every week, votes at their elections, I don't necessarily think that they're really interested in having to elect an MEP, an MP, a police commissioner.
People have little time for politics.
Exactly, yeah. I think that a lot of people don't really want to have so much bureaucracy, so much voting. So it's almost like there's, in some ways you could strangely say that there's too much democracy, but actually it still doesn't give the person the voice
that they think
that they have in some ways.
It's almost, I think it's a faux democracy, or it's a democratic face on it.
Yes.
But is it actually giving democratic effect? Not necessarily. Or not,
I think that's the point that I'm trying to make, and it's if we look at the statistics in terms of how many people go out and vote for their MPs, I don't think a lot of people do. I know a lot of my friends don't. If you hear about European elections, they never really have been so heavily broadcasted across the country.
European elections, the turnout's abysmal,
Absolutely.
even compared to national elections.
And I think when you then consider that the European Union does have elements of it that can control our laws and some aspects of our democracy, one would naturally think that, well, European elections should actually be taken just as seriously as elections to members of parliament. And I don't think at the moment that's the case, and I think that a lot of people now are starting to see that. So,
and you always have to ask yourself the question then, why? Why is that the case? Why are they not taken more seriously? And I think it's a reflection of the fact that
it's quite distant, it's quite remote.
Yes, and I guess on one point, I'm sort of going to note the fact here that all three of us have an IT background. I would not say that democracy scales well, if you take my point, beyond a certain point.
So you're getting to the core design of the European Union there, because the European Union is taking a union like the United Kingdom and then times it by 10.
The trouble is when you have this argument that, if I say it doesn't scale well, then you end up having to say, well, where is the unit? What is the ideal?
Yeah.
Because the opposite side of that is people then say, oh, well, we could work all the way back down the other way. Why don't we have town hall democracy? And everything is decided on the basis of that. For me, the nation state is the unit. And I base that on, you go back to the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, when it was first established that because a lot of, at that time you had a lot of sort of feudal warlords and all that sort of thing having wars around Europe, and it was first established at that time that when different armies, different forces were fighting one another, they were acting in the interests of what was the birth of the idea of the nation state.
Yeah.
And it goes all the way back to that, in Europe at least.
But isn't that the point of Europe, to avoid those wars? You know what I mean? Because
I can get on to
sorry,
that.
go on.
For me, when I look at how much has changed, I don't think that has fundamentally changed. The nation state is still the unit. What the European project is trying to do in Europe is change that and say it's not the unit anymore. Actually, the unit is the level of this.
Yes.
In terms of wars, well,
I think the unit of democracy is open to debate. And some people think that it should be the nation state. Some people should it be even more. Pushed down. The principle of subsidiarity that the European Union claims to follow. Or some people think that it should all be centralised to a technocracy in the centre. I think that debate can be had, and it needs to be somewhere on that. And we're on one side, and the pro-European people are on the other side. But I think one of the reasons for the European Union, for it to be created, was to try and prevent a third world war. You see what I mean? And because you were talking about the Treaty of Westphalia and these kind of warring factions that were kind of bounded by the nationalisms, and I would say that actually political union is not required. A technocracy, a pan-continental technocracy, is not required to avoid a third world war.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? I think a third world war can be avoided by strong trading links. You know what I mean?
I was thinking just that actually just now. I think you could use the analogy of take a cul-de-sac street, for example, and you have 10 houses on that cul-de-sac.
Yeah.
Do we need to remove all of those fences and all live sort of as one?
An open plan street.
Yeah, an open plan street as such, should I say.
Open plan neighbourhood.
I think that kind of, that view is kind of like, well, yeah, take all of the fences down. We'll all live together. Everybody can just walk into each other's houses. Oh, but if we don't have that, we're going to have a war with each other. And you kind of think, well, if you narrow it down to that side on a scale that people would understand, you kind of see, well, actually, it's not really true, because sometimes borders and sometimes fences, sometimes differences are needed and are a good
can
thing,
be positive,
because people, especially when you take Europe, for example, has a background of such different cultures. It's not like the US, where the United States tends to be United States in terms of they have very high levels of similarity among one another.
Some people would disagree with that, but I agree with you.
I think there are elements of that. But
yes,
I think in terms of comparing that to Europe, the European member states of the European Union actually are still very different to each other. So if you go into France and then you travel across into Italy, or you travel across to Spain or Germany, you see the huge change in culture. There is a big change in difference, and I don't think fusing them together in the way that the European Union has progressed or potentially wants to is always the best answer. And I actually fear now that it could create more divide. As we've seen with Brexit, people want to put barriers back up now.
There's an argument to say that essentially it's a one-size-fits-all model, and we know that one-size-fits-all is a bit of a fantasy. It doesn't really work. There are these huge differences that, as I say, as I sort of mentioned before, when we consider change and things that have changed over time, it's also important to bear in mind in our thinking what has not changed. And what has not changed throughout all of the ever closer union that we've seen with the EEC and then the EU is the fact that these countries, as you say, are actually very different in a lot of ways. That has not changed.
But it's not just culture, right? I mean, for example, to take the Mediterranean countries, they've got completely different geostrategic and political problems. You know what I mean? Like, for example, they've got a sea border which has got the other side of that's in the Mediterranean Sea. You've got Northern Africa, right? And so some of the problems that these countries want to address, you could argue, are best dealt with by the people closest to those problems, rather than all the way in Belgium, many thousands of miles away. And I think there's actually an argument as a techie, I think in terms of bandwidth, right, and information flow, what's the most scalable architecture? Well, it's a distributed architecture, isn't it? You don't have one massive, you don't go to Intel and say, give me the biggest processor you've got and stick it in the biggest machine you've got. That's the kind of old-fashioned mainframe solution. What we have nowadays is lots of tiny little iPhones everywhere mining Bitcoin, you know what I mean? It's kind of a massively distributed architecture. So actually the European Union is actually a very old-fashioned model of a centralization that was necessary. It's monolithic. It was necessary back in 1940 or whenever it was, because we didn't have iPhones. We didn't have the web. We didn't have the high bandwidth fiber optic network.
The ability to pick up your phone and speak to somebody in France or speak to your friends in Germany now.
Exactly.
It brings people closer together naturally. So I think you could argue actually technology is stopping wars and communication is stopping wars, and people being able to communicate effectively and instantly with each other.
And it's also worth bearing in mind that the European Union is, or what led to the European Union, is not the only body that emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War. The UN, NATO, other factors there. But I think if we're thinking analogies and things that were needed then, this is an analogy I've used before of if you break your leg and you have very little mobility, then you will need a cast, you will need your crutches. You will have your crutches, you will hobble around for a bit. But when your leg, you need those at the time so that you can move. But when your leg heals,
yes,
you no longer need them, and you hand back the crutch, you hand back the cast, and that's supposed to be a happy day. But wouldn't it be a strange thing to do once your leg had healed to actually carry on hobbling around the place on the crutches? And I sort of view the European Union, or rather the attitudes towards it and the views behind it, as a bit like that crutch. Okay, so maybe in the aftermath of the Second World War we needed a way of bringing Europe together. Fine. Do we need that now? Are we saying that we still need to rely on the crutch? And I guess what I'm saying is, if you want to call yourself progressive, as many people see the European Union as, no. Progress is when you do not, as you say, require political union in order to avoid wars.
Well, what I would say to that is that even if that analogy is not completely right, I think that I forgot what I was going to say now.
It's that cold wind.
It's very cold.
Blows the thoughts.
Sorry, go on. It'll come back to me in a minute.
I was done.
No, I think Patrick was touching on the subject. I suppose you could say the European Union after the war was implemented to create that extra level of stability, perhaps stabilisers on a bike as such. And now we've grown to a point where we don't need those stabilisers anymore. We can take them off, and we are sorry, as in the continent of Europe, we don't need those stabilisers on the bike anymore. We can take them off and continue balancing and cycling along the route that we have been doing. So.
And that's and I remember my point now was that effectively what happened in 2016 was a change of mind, right? We in 1975 we had a view that we wanted to move towards a closer union, and there's some argument about whether it was presented in a truthful way, because on the ballot paper it said common market, I think, and that was possibly, arguably, not quite what people were staying a member of. But I think we have to, if we're to live in a healthy society, live in a world where we can change course, because it's not guaranteed that the course that we're set on necessarily is the right course 50 years down the line. You know what I mean? No one could have imagined the iPhone back in 1940, and so all the internet.
And there's a way of saying, that Brexit really is about choice, and is about the ability to live in a world, I think, for me, in which these huge blocks are a choice. They're an option. They are not a necessity. They are not an inevitability. It is not the case that all roads lead to Brussels, as we used to say, all roads lead to Rome in Europe. Because once that is the case, and it claims to stand for such very progressive values, and it's not the case that it hasn't done good things, then you get a conflation in people's minds with this symbol of all those things actually becoming and embodying the very notion of all of these wonderful progressive ideas. And once that's the case, it can do no wrong in the minds of a lot of people. And to wield that, when you wield that kind of power over hearts and minds, because that is where power is exercised fundamentally. We can talk about courts, we can talk about legislatures, we can talk about executives, but actually power, I'm going to get a bit biblical, if you wield the power to cause people to believe that you are the way, the truth and the life, John 14:6 I believe, then you have created a true monopoly of the Spirit. Now, from a Christian perspective, I would argue, well, that's appropriate for God, but nothing of mankind born should wield that power.
Right. I mean, I think what you're saying is it should be open to criticism, and effectively, 2016 was the biggest criticism of the European Union ever in terms of the United Kingdom, and so
they
we
needed
decided that
because
it was worthy of criticism. We criticised it, and that's a valid intellectual and rational position to hold.
Absolutely, and you have to think about what would happen, I think, also, if we had voted to remain. They would have seen it as a massive endorsement of everything they've done over the past couple of decades.
Yeah.
And really this is why Brexit is so necessary, because what was needed now is what happened, that we sent them the message that actually no, it is not the case that you can do whatever you want and people will always fall in line and you will always be able to, if they don't, put them back down again and say, yes, you will go with what we're saying. It is vital that this happens. You could argue that Brexit is more than about just Britain, more even than about Europe, that it's about the world. Because we have to have this message out there that if you are the 5th largest economy in the world, etc., 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 it's a choice and it's up to you. You can be in or out, and you know what? Either way, it will not be economic ruin. It will not be political suicide, because I don't want to live in a world where that is not the case and this inevitability of these huge regional blocks is locked in. That is not a good world from my point of view. Far too much power centralised then with those blocks. And that never goes well.
I think that's a voice that's been replicated throughout human history, really. If you take, for example, there's never been, should we say, a successful empire. They've all collapsed in the end. Even the British Empire, although dissolved peacefully, there has always been, people always seem to want to take back control, I think, as Boris Johnson put it in the referendum. So to take back control.
But you see there, as you say most astutely, all civilizations have their time. And you see towards the end of them, usually what you find is a level of decadence, a level of corruption that I think is present at the upper echelons of the European Union. You look at the appointment of Martin Selmayr recently to that role that's now been criticised by
Martin Selmayr.
Yes.
Right. And what's his position now?
I'm sketchy on that one, but I remember reading it. You had what the position was, but basically it's been investigated and it's been found to be not within the spirit of union law at all. But he's still there.
Yeah.
And the general revolving door that you have with bureaucrats, that's the kind of bureaucracy and the kind of corruption that you got towards the end of these empires. If you look at the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Egyptians, you started to see this sort of thing happening.
But isn't that symptomatic of them being removed from the democratic grip? For example, if it was an MP that had been somehow appointed by some shady means, then either that wouldn't have happened in the first place because they would have felt threatened by the electorate, or the electorate could have held them to account 5 years down the line.
Well, even in those older empires, there wasn't much in the way of democracy, to be honest. They were essentially dictatorships. But the corruption was coming about in a different way, not so much to do with whether it was direct democracy or not, because it wasn't anyway. But what we're seeing, I think now within the European Union, is something similar to that. And it's not just about Europe; it's Western civilization in general that I would worry for. So Brexit is, as I think you mentioned earlier, is a reset. It's an opportunity to show the world, well, that we're not locked on this course. We large G7 countries, for example, we are not locked on this course, and there are alternatives, there are options. They can work. They are not the end of the world. That is the message from Britain to the world about Brexit.
So we're all recharged with Dr. Pepper, Dr. Pepper and nicotine. So so what are we talking about? Talking about fear in Europe of no-deal Brexit, or just a Brexit in general?
No, well, I think the point that I was trying to make there was, and I think Patrick was agreeing, is that if we successfully leave, is it that the European Union then thinks that's such a huge risk for their project, that other countries, and I think this has been mentioned in the media before, may follow suit.
Oh, I see.
So therefore, it would mean that the European Union, the Commission, loses that element of control, that element of power that they have currently
Over the member
established
states, right?
over those member states.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of countries will see, if Britain can do it, then so can we.
If you look at that from a power point of view, I mean, the analogy of the abusive relationship has been used before, and when I think about that, I'm thinking about the use of language. When you think about this archetype of the abusive partner, the things that you hear them saying, you can't go, you're nothing without me, you'll be nothing without me, or, okay, fine, off you go, but you'll be back. Now, that is exactly the sort of language that we've heard coming out of Europe over these past couple of years. And you have to be careful, obviously, not to take this too far, but I just look at that, I think the messaging has been, of course you can't leave successfully, but Juncker says Brexit cannot be a success, and maybe he meant may not be a success. We've had them saying Britain will be much reduced without its membership of the EU. Okay, so you'll be nothing without me. And then you have, well, you can leave, but you'll be back. Well, I forget whether it was Juncker or Tusk who said that, but I think it was Tusk who was saying the British, we think they will rejoin in a few years' time and all that sort of thing. And I thought, I look at this behaviour and I spot some analogies with almost a jilted partner here who...
Yeah, it doesn't strike me as being the most healthy relationship. And it's almost as though there's a willful blindness to that in elements of the media and on the Remain side. Because
in that building.
If the European Union was genuinely a project about collaboration and friendly neighbourliness, then surely there would be a democratic decision has been taken in the United Kingdom. It's unfortunate, but let's make the best of it. And perhaps in the future, because we're such good friends, maybe we'll end up closer together. You know what I mean? Maybe there will be a change of heart in the future. But it's not been like that. They've actually doubled and tripled down on the...
That makes me think of a very wise old phrase I've heard before, which is, you see it on fridge magnets, so it must be wise and old. If you love something, set it free. If it comes back to you, it's yours. If it doesn't, it was never meant to be.
Yeah.
And I think that applies here very much.
I think so. I think what's sad as well, when you mention the media, there often seems to be. I think the media often focus on the European Union and they represent that as Europe. So what happens is you will get, well, actually, your vote was actually, you want to leave all of those countries and all of those people, and not actually the reasons I voted to leave was actually because I don't like the political union that's been created. Not the fact that I don't like French people, that I don't like Spanish people. I have many friends from across Europe, many who also want to leave the European Union.
Same here.
Which is, a strange concept to Remainers sometimes, because they think, oh no, if you want to leave Europe, you must hate all Europeans. And you think, no, that's not true at all. And I think that the European Union has probably also set an image that they are Europe and not a union, a European Union, a political organisation.
That's their aspiration, isn't it?
There's a conflation there.
They want that conflation to be true, don't they?
Yes.
And if you repeat it often enough, it probably, they hope it will become the truth.
And then that leads us down a bit of a sad path where actually they're now creating some divide, perhaps even some dislike.
Because if that's true, then once Britain leaves, then we're not part of Europe anymore. You see what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, officially we still are part of the European. We sit on the continent. The tectonic plates aren't going to change.
Yeah.
We just don't subscribe to. Well, we hope. Don't say that.
Yeah.
that'll be in the Remain campaign next. Huge earthquake caused by Brexit.
Yes.
But, I think that there's a strong aspect of people trying to conflate Europe with the political union. And I think that's actually damaging to the relationship between British people and the people that they actually quite often do love across Europe and the cultures that we do love. And I think that there needs to be more of an argument made to remove the perception that European Union is Europe, because it's not. It's a political structure that manages and controls Europe. It isn't actually Europe.
I mean, I have a long history in the Netherlands, and still many friends over there, and certainly they were surprised, perhaps a little nonplussed when I told them how I had voted. I went last October.
But it's not nonplussed, is it? Because nonplussed would be kind of just like relaxed about it, wouldn't it? Nonplussed. I don't know.
I think they were certainly bemused by it, but really that I went prepared because I knew I was going to have to be in order to talk to people about this in a way that could try and make sense to them.
Yeah.
Because it really is quite alien to a lot of people, the way that I and many others chose to vote in this country. And I think that it's symptomatic of what you're talking about then. It's the end result, it's the consequence of, it's what you see in the real world of this conflation that has been going on in people's minds over many decades.
That's right, and you're right, and kind of this kind of narrative has an impact on the continent with real people, where they see it as a rejection of them.
Yes.
And particularly the narrative about racism and nativism and ethno-nationalism. People in Europe are like, well, we hope we can still be friends, but of course that kind of plaintive cry is predicated on the fact that on the assumption that Brexit was a rejection of them, when it isn't. It's a rejection of the supranational structure on top of them.
Somebody actually said that to me. A good friend of mine. We had a very long discussion about this, and he said to me at the end, it's over in the Netherlands, sorry, well, you know, we can still be friends.
Yeah.
He meant me and him.
But
because of this.
The premise is totally wrong.
The fact that he even mentioned that.
Exactly.
And I said this to him, the fact that you say that.
You don't get it.
The precedent's been set, hasn't it, in some ways, that you know, if you're not part of this political union, then, you know, you're obviously not our friends.
Yeah.
And if you go back to the relationship analogy that you was using, that would indicate to me quite a toxic environment in some ways.
Yeah.
It's when the mask slips.
Yes.
And you see that.
And I think it is slipping, especially now. I think we're seeing, as Brexit has taken fold, I think we're now seeing Europeans. There's a bit of a situation in France, and we've seen in the media. We've seen. I'm going to understate it. We shan't touch upon that.
We shouldn't laugh. Actually,
no,
we should not laugh.
But you know, we're seeing now they're burning European flags in France, and I have actually got Dutch friends who, well, I mean, the Dutch and the Belgians have a bit of a history around them socially, I think, where there's a little bit of competition, and maybe I wouldn't say dislike, but friction might be the
it's almost a sibling
word.
Relationship in the same way that France and Germany have, and other European, and we have with France, with Germany, and with other countries. There's this sort of sibling relationship that goes on. We don't always like each other, but we know each other very well. We live very close to one another, and you would hope ultimately we can pull together. And what we're saying is, your way of pulling together is no longer going to be the way. There are going to be alternatives. There'll be other ways of pulling together. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that we have this choice. And there needs to be that choice. You can, if you want to, you can turn this into a free market style argument. You can talk about monopolies. The European Union, you could argue, has attempted to monopolise these progressive values, this notion of unity, this idea of peace, prosperity, freedom. But it's our way or the highway, mate. That's what they're saying. And what we're saying is, actually, no, it isn't. And that is a role that, I'm not going to get into this, but if you look at history and history of Europe in a certain way, that is a role that Britain has often played on the European stage. And you know what, here in 2016, 17, 18, 19, in terms of what has and hasn't changed, well, that's not changed. We're doing the same thing again, as we often have with Europe in the past.